Welcome to the Psychology of Us. This podcast is created by RJ Starr, a public intellectual and independent psychology educator. The material presented is educational and interpretive, examining psychological life as a domain of understanding rather than intervention. It does not provide therapy, diagnosis, or professional guidance. Each episode stands as a complete work of public psychological inquiry.
When an individual begins to question their own consistency, the reflexive approach in contemporary psychology is almost always a demand for definition.
Right. It centers entirely around clarifying traits and beliefs.
Exactly. The inquiry is always, who is this person? Or what is their identity? Because there is this pervasive assumption that once identity is adequately clarified, psychological coherence just automatically follows.
Yes.
So today's deep dive explores RJ Starr's essay on psychological architecture. And the mission here is to examine the structural conditions that actually allow a person to remain intact.
Because observation demonstrates that knowing oneself does not guarantee the self is always available.
It really does.
And that foundational assumption treats the self as this static entity. The conventional belief is that if an individual simply knows their preferences and stabilizes their internal narrative, well, the self will remain accessible regardless of the circumstance. But Starr's work dismantles that premise by demonstrating that becoming a person is not merely a task of definition. It is a matter of architecture. An individual can possess a highly developed, articulate sense of identity, yet still experience themselves as entirely reactive or fractured across different contexts.
I want to challenge the immediate conclusion most would draw from that fracturing, though. Because the common assumption is that if a person experiences themselves as inconsistent or reactive, that individual simply has a weak identity.
Right. They assume a strong identity would withstand the pressure.
Exactly. But Starr's essay reframes this entirely. It is not a flawed identity.
No, it is a failure of conditions. Treating the failure to maintain coherence as a flaw in the person's identity is a structural misunderstanding.
I see.
The question must shift away from identifying who the individual is and move toward understanding the structural conditions under which that individual can maintain their integrity. We have to define a concept here, intactness.
Okay.
Intactness is not an emotional state. It is not a fixed temperamental trait.
So how does the essay define it structurally?
Well, intactness is the specific condition in which perception, decision, and action are aligned, rather than fractured. It is the state where an individual is able to perceive an environment clearly, make a choice based on that direct perception without excessive internal interference, and then execute an action.
So the self is not observing itself in that state.
Exactly. It is simply operate. Intactness is entirely a property of the individual in relation to their surrounding conditions.
So if intactness requires this uninterrupted alignment of perception, choice, and action, what breaks that sequence first? The text points immediately to time. Let us examine the first condition, pace, and the integrity of decision.
Yes, pace.
It appears that the structural mechanics of a decision rely heavily on the tempo at which the decision is permitted to occur.
Pace is foundational to psychological coherence. When an individual operates at a self-directed tempo, the decision sequence resolves cleanly. The sequence is literal and linear. The individual perceives a set of options, makes a choice, and takes action. Crucially, once the action concludes at a self-directed pace, the decision is allowed to stand. The attentional resources move forward to the next requirement.
But when external pressure alters that tempo, the sequence destabilizes.
Oh, absolutely. Time compresses, demands accumulate, and the structure of the decision changes entirely. In a compressed temporal state, decisions fundamentally lose their closure.
They just don't settle.
Right. A choice that was perfectly settled a moment prior becomes subject to immediate reevaluation. Because the time parameter is restricted, the individual begins to check, adjust, and reconsider the action they just took. The psychological system is no longer moving forward through a sequence.
It begins oscillating.
Exactly.
Let us walk through a very simple literal example to clarify the mechanics of this oscillation. Just consider the act of selecting a garment to wear. At a stable, self-directed pace, the sequence is highly efficient. The individual looks at the available options, selects a specific item of clothing, puts it on, and the sequence is complete.
The decision concludes.
Right. The individual moves on to the next task of the day.
However, observe what happens to that exact same individual if the temporal structure is suddenly compressed by an abrupt external time constraint.
Yeah.
The individual might select the same garment, but the compressed pace does not allow the decision to settle. They put the garment on and immediately begin to second-guess the choice.
They might change into a second garment, then reconsider and change a third time.
Yes. And the most important observation here is that the physical options have not changed. The objective adequacy of the garments remains identical to the first scenario.
What is altered is purely the temporal structure.
Exactly. The compressed pace interrupts the sequence before closure can be registered by the system.
I mean, this looping creates a fascinating and highly problematic false sense of unreliability within the individual.
It really does.
When the decision sequence is repeatedly interrupted by a compressed pace over time, the psychological system begins to misinterpret that mechanical interruption as a generalized hesitancy. The system mistakenly reads a structural condition, specifically the lack of adequate time to close a decision, as a permanent temperamental trait.
The individual assumes they're simply an indecisive person.
Exactly.
But the individual's judgment itself was never poor. It simply was never permitted to observe the outcome of a completed choice.
Right.
The system lacks the data of a finished decision, so it registers the ongoing process as an internal flaw.
That moves the analysis to a complication. What happens when the pressure is not just temporal but observational?
Exposure.
Right. The second condition is exposure, the fragmentation of attention. The text is very careful to distinguish between simply being among others, which allows for unified attention, and being subject to evaluative judgment.
Which results in fragmented attention. The distinction is critical. When an individual is merely in the presence of others without an implicit demand, attention remains unified. The person speaks, acts, and moves without continuously referencing themselves from an external viewpoint.
But when the individual is subject to evaluative judgment,
Right. When the exposure carries the possibility of a verdict or a performance demand, attention fundamentally splits. A portion of the individual's attention engages with the environment, while another portion actively observes and monitors the self from an imagined exterior perspective.
but the internal question shifts entirely. It is no longer what does the individual prefer. The question becomes, how will this action be read by the observers?
Yes. To manage that shift, the system adopts divided processing. One channel continues to execute actions while the other channel simultaneously monitors those actions from the outside.
So the monitoring function moves from the background to the foreground.
Exactly, and it actively consumes attentional resources that would otherwise be dedicated entirely to direct perception and straightforward decision-making.
I want to push back on the mechanics of this monitoring function a bit,
Yeah.
because one might assume it only operates when the observers are physically present.
Sure.
Yet the text points out the persistent nature of this state. The evaluative monitoring function often fails to resolve even when the external pressure recedes.
That is true.
An individual might spend hours in a highly evaluative environment, leave that environment, and return to a quiet, private space where they are entirely alone.
Yeah.
But the internal state does not reset.
It does not reset because the imagined audience is indeterminate. When an individual is evaluating their own actions based on how they might be perceived, well, that question can never fully resolve because there is always another possible interpretation to consider.
So the structure remains fractured.
Exactly. The system continues to check and assess the individual's actions, even in complete isolation.
The evaluative orientation becomes temporarily self-sustaining. The monitoring continues running, making even basic, well-established preferences difficult for the individual to access. It becomes clear that intactness requires a relational field where the individual's presence is not strictly contingent on continuous self-assessment.
And if the internal structure is fractured by evaluative exposure, it is equally impacted by the external spatial structure. This is the third condition.
Sensory, coherence, and environmental structure.
Right.
I have to admit some initial confusion here. It is easy to accept that time pressure or extreme social judgment alters a person's behavior. But asserting that visually, acoustically, or spatially disorganized environments have a direct structural impact on an individual's identity seems like a massive leap.
It sounds like a leap, yes.
I mean, how does a disorganized room or harsh lighting fundamentally destabilize the self?
Well, it destabilizes the self by diffusing attention. When an environment is sensorially disorganized, external order is unavailable. So the psychological system must compensate for that lack of external order by tightening internally.
It attempts to impose an internal structure to manage the chaotic inputs.
Exactly. This mechanical tightening manifests directly as heightened internal vigilance. Conversely, an environment that is sensorially coherent meaning it is consistent in lighting, tone, and spatial arrangement, stabilizes perception.
Because the system does not need to allocate resources to overcompensate for the space.
Exactly.
And this operates entirely below the level of explicit awareness. The individual is not consciously thinking about the lighting. But misaligned factors, like extreme temperature fluctuations, harsh lighting, or acoustic chaos, constantly draw attention inward. The environment amplifies minor discrepancies.
Yes, a small detail that would normally go unnoticed in a coherent environment suddenly becomes a focal point of intense scrutiny in a disorganized one. The perceptual system is being pushed toward its threshold by the accumulated demands of the environment.
Right.
A well-ordered environment reduces the baseline level of internal effort required to maintain structural coherence. A disordered environment drastically increases that required effort.
Which dictates the depth of available attentional resources. That clarifies the stakes immensely. When the system is consumed by compensatory adjustments just to manage harsh light or a chaotic spatial arrangement, the tolerance for ambiguity plummets.
Drops to zero.
Sustaining focus or completing a decision requires proportionally more effort because the available resources are already depleted by the sheer structure of the environment.
The system is trapped in a state of constant internal adjustment, which leaves far less of the individual available for external action or clear decision-making.
And that inward pull logically connects to the physical structure of the person themselves, which brings us to the fourth condition.
Right, embodiment and the threshold of awareness.
Yes.
When the physical body is at ease, attention naturally orients outward toward the environment. The physical form functions merely as a stable background, allowing the individual to engage fully with their surroundings.
But when the body experiences tension, constriction, or physical discomfort,
the orientation of attention reverses violently. Attention is immediately drawn inward. The individual becomes highly aware of specific physical sensations, and this awareness is incredibly selective.
How does that selective awareness create perceptual distortion?
Well, attention concentrates heavily on a single area of physical tension, entirely excluding other neutral or positive inputs. This localized physical discomfort often leads the individual to form conclusions about their environment or their decisions that feel absolute or total.
Oh, I see.
The individual experiences a global sense that a choice is completely wrong or a situation is entirely unmanageable. But that global conclusion is actually dictated by a severely narrowed perceptual frame caused by localized physical constriction.
So perception is not a neutral lens. It is strictly shaped by where attention is forced to direct itself. Connecting this directly to the previous condition of sensory coherence, environmental disorder and bodily tension must compound one another extensively.
They do. Elevated environmental vigilance significantly lowers the threshold at which bodily sensations become intrusive. If an individual is physically at ease, they can tolerate a degree of spatial or acoustic disorder without a significant loss of structural coherence. But if the individual is already experiencing physical tension, that exact same disorganized environment becomes vastly more disruptive.
Because the lack of sensory coherence and the presence of bodily tension continually reinforce each other.
Exactly. They operate in a loop, continuously pulling attention inward and blocking the state of intactness.
So when all of these factors are active, when time is compressed, when evaluative monitoring is running, when the environment is disorganized, and when the body is tense, how does a decision ever actually finish?
Structurally, it doesn't.
It doesn't.
No. And that is the fifth condition, decisional closure. For an individual to remain intact, choices must stand. There must be a firm conclusion to the decision sequence without immediate reconsideration.
Right. Action must follow decision without interruption in order to establish structural continuity.
Yes. When that closure is absent, the system becomes recursive. Choices are repeatedly revisited and revised. Each revision introduces new variables, which in turn require further consideration. The individual simply cannot exit the decision.
This recursive looping is very frequently misread by the individual and observers as thoroughness, though.
It is. It looks like careful, meticulous consideration. But structurally, it is an inability to finalize the sequence. And this is exactly where the previous conditions conspire to block the exit.
Evaluative exposure keeps the external register open.
Right. The individual cannot close the decision because they are still actively imagining how an indeterminate audience will assess it. Simultaneously, pace pressure compresses the time window, forcing the decision to reopen before it can ever stabilize.
The compounding residue of these unclosed loops creates a massive burden. The individual experiences a generalized, accumulated state of unresolved tension.
Yes, and over time, the person observes this structural block, the recurring fact that their decisions are never permitted to conclude, and they misattribute it.
They assume they lack the fundamental capacity for judgment.
Exactly. They assume constitutional indecisiveness, when in reality, the structural conditions simply never allowed the judgment to finish. The system never experiences the pure conclusion of an action. The register remains permanently open, gathering unresolved data.
That misattribution forces a transition in how we view the individual over time. We have to move from analyzing acute conditions to the longitudinal turn.
Yes.
The analysis shifts from temporary disruptions, a compressed afternoon, a highly evaluative meeting, a single chaotic room, to chronic exposure extending over months or years. What happens when these conditions are the permanent state of affairs?
When an individual operates under these fractured conditions chronically, the effects are no longer merely additive. It is not just a collection of difficult days. The effects become fully structural.
Structural.
Yes. The psychological system functions by drawing conclusions based on repeated data. Because the decisional sequence was chronically prevented from completing, the system draws a functional conclusion that its own judgment is inherently suspect.
The judgment cannot be trusted to finish, so the pattern of deferral calcifies.
Yes.
The self structurally reorganizes around the fragmentation itself.
That is the defining mechanism of chronic exposure. The individual's relationship to their own preferences is entirely reorganized. The evaluative monitoring function operates for so long that it becomes structurally prior to preference.
Wow.
The system assesses before it feels. It imagines external reception before it acts. The evaluative stance ceases to be a temporary response to a demanding external environment, and it actually becomes the internal architecture.
The individual loses reliable access to what they would choose in the strict absence of an audience.
Exactly.
It is absolutely paramount to emphasize that this resulting configuration, a structure built entirely around continuous vigilance, deferral, and recursive self-monitoring, is not a broken version of the self.
No, it is not.
It is an adapted architecture. The conventional psychological framework assumes identity is a fixed entity the person brings to their circumstances, and if it fractures, it is damaged. But this longitudinal view demonstrates that chronic structural conditions actually shape and reorganize the architecture of the identity itself.
The individual is not broken. The system has adapted with precision to an environment that demanded fragmented attention and consistently blocked decisional closure.
The adaptation formed structurally to manage chronic exposure.
Right. Reversing the state requires altering the structural conditions within which the system operates, allowing perception to gradually precede evaluation once again.
This necessitates a complete re-examination of how the self is questioned. The inquiry typically begins with the conventional question, who am I?
But that must move to the structural question. Under what conditions am I able to remain that person?
Which inevitably leads to the prior question, what would I be if the conditions had been different?
And that final question is purely diagnostic, not rhetorical.
This has been The Psychology of Us. The work presented here is part of a public psychological archive by RJ Starr. It is educational and interpretive, not clinical or advisory. Episodes are published as finished reflections and are intended to be encountered as complete works.